Cora Belle Haugen was 17 the summer the topsoil left in the wind. She sat in the yard dust with a burnt willow nub in her fingers, drawing her mother's cracked hands across the back of an empty flour sack. The neighbor women passed on the road. They called her the laziest girl in Cimarron County. They said it loud, so she would hear. She didn't look up. She kept the line steady. That was all she knew how to do, keep the line steady while the world talked. A week later, the schoolmaster pinned a page to the board at the front of the room. It was torn from the National Clarion. It was the drawing the whole country was weeping over that year. He held it up to 30 children, and he pointed at Cora and he said, "This is what a gift looks like. You, Cora Haugen, will never make a single thing the world wants to see." The class laughed. She said nothing. And here is the thing you already know that they did not. The drawing on that torn page was hers. It came from her hand. They just hadn't looked close enough to see it. For 3 mornings, a dust-caked government car had been idling at the Haugen fence. A man with a leather notebook kept folding her loose sketches into his coat. Nobody in Mercer Flat knew why. Not yet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, if you like stories where the quiet ones are finally seen, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Cora's story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning and go slow because the whole thing turns on how easy she was to miss. Cora Belle Haugen grew up where the topsoil left in the wind. Mercer Flat, out in Cimarron County in the Oklahoma Panhandle. The far dry corner of the state where the land runs so level you can watch a storm come for an hour before it reaches you. It was the drought summer of 1936. The rain had gone somewhere and forgotten the way back. The wheat came up thin and gold and wrong, and then it didn't come up at all. The dust came instead. It came in low brown walls that swallowed the sun at noon. It piled against the fence posts like snow that would not melt. It got into the milk and the flour and the corners of your eyes. And you learned to live with the grit between your teeth because there was nowhere it wasn't. The Haugen place was a quarter section behind the section road. 160 acres of good dirt that had gone to powder. There was a house that Halvard Haugen built with his own hands the year he came home from the Great War, and a barn leaning gently east. And a windmill that turned and turned and pulled up water that came slower every month. And there was a note. That was the thing that sat over the house the way the dust sat over the county. The family owed $612 to the Cimarron Farmers and Merchants Trust. $612. And 60 days. And then the bank would call the auction and the quarter section would belong to somebody else. Cora knew the number. Everybody in the house knew the number. It was the number they didn't say at supper. She did her chores first. That mattered to her, and it should matter to you. Because the town would soon say she didn't. She was up before the light. She fed the chickens that were left, and there weren't many. She carried water. She scrubbed the wash on a board until her knuckles went raw, and she hung it in a wind that dried it in 10 minutes and dusted it brown in 20. She helped her mother turn the last of the seed potatoes so the soft ones didn't spoil the rest. She did the work of a grown woman, and she did it without complaint, because complaint didn't move a bucket. And then, when the work was done, in the hour before the light went, she drew. She drew on whatever there was, butcher paper. When there was butcher paper. The white margins of the seed catalogs the co-op sent and nobody could afford to order from. The blank backs of the auction bills that blew up the road from the foreclosed places, the Dunmores, the Sykes, the little Kessler quarter that went under in the spring. Those bills came printed on one side. Public auction. Notice of sale. Everything on the North 40 must go. She turned them over and drew on the clean back, and there was something in that she understood without words. The paper said a family was finished. She made it say a family had been here. Her charcoal was a nub of burnt willow no longer than her thumb. She'd made it herself in a tin can with the lid pressed down, the way her grandmother taught her, and she guarded it in the pocket of her apron the way another girl might guard a ring. When it wore down to nothing, she'd make another. But she was careful with it. She held it like it was the last one in the world. What did she draw? She drew the truth of what she saw so that it wouldn't be forgotten. That was the whole of it. She had no bigger idea than that. She drew the breadline down at the Boise City Depot, the men standing with their hats in their hands and their collars turned up, the way they looked at the ground so they wouldn't have to look at each other. She drew the Dunmore place after they left it, the door standing open, the curtain still in the window, a child's shoe on the step. She drew the windmill and the dead garden and the long empty road. And more than anything, over and over, she drew her mother's hands. Ingrid Haugen was 44, and she had the hands of a woman twice that. They were cracked across the knuckles from lye and cold water. They were always moving, kneading, mending, wringing, folding. Cora drew them at the stove that had gone cold because there was nothing to cook. She drew them holding the coffee cup with the chip in the rim. She drew them still, once, folded in Ingrid's lap on a Sunday, and even still they looked tired. She never made her mother pretty. She never made anything pretty. She made it true and tender, which is not the same as pretty and is much harder. She never once drew to mock. She drew the way you'd hold a hurt bird, carefully and close and without a sound. That was Cora, a quiet girl with a burnt stick, recording a world that was blowing away, in the last light of the day, while the people who watched her called it idleness. You needed to love her first. So that's who she was. Hold on to her. Because now the trouble starts. It started with a car at the fence. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning, the light already gone flat and brown. Cora was at the pump filling the stock trough when she heard it, an engine laboring up the section road under a rooster tail of dust. Cars didn't come out to Mercer Flat much anymore. Nobody had the gasoline. She stood with the pump handle in her hand and watched it slow and stop at the Haugen fence. It was a government car. You could tell by the plain dark color of it and the seal on the door, though it was so caked in road dust you could barely read the letters. A man got out. He was maybe 40, in a suit that had been good once and was gray with grit now, and he took his hat off when he saw her, which not many men bothered to do for a farm girl at a pump. He had a leather notebook under his arm and a canvas case over his shoulder. "Morning," he called. "I'm sorry to trouble you. My name's Silas Meade. I'm with the Federal Farm Survey." He held up a folded paper as if she could read it from there. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some water. My radiator's boiling and I've got another 30 miles of this." Cora didn't say anything for a moment. Strangers made her shy in a way that felt like a hand around her throat. She just nodded and worked the pump and filled a bucket. And he came through the gate and thanked her and poured it steaming into the front of the car. Then he stood there a while, wiping his hands on a rag, looking out at the powdered field and the leaning barn. "You folks holding on?" he asked. Not the way the neighbors asked it, to have something to cluck about. He asked it like a man writing something down. "We're holding on," Cora said. That was the whole sentence. She wasn't one for more. He nodded slowly. And then his eye caught the porch rail, where she'd laid 3 sketches out to set. He walked over without asking, the way a man does when he forgets himself, and he leaned down and looked at them a long time. The breadline, the Dunmore door, her mother's hands around the chipped cup. He didn't say they were good. That's what she remembered later. He didn't say a single thing about good. He just got very quiet, and something moved across his face, and he said, "Did you do these?" "When my work's done," Cora said quickly, the way she'd learned to say it, because she was always being accused. "Washington's collecting pictures," Meade said, "of hard times, of how it looks out here, so the people back east understand what they're voting on." He straightened up. "Would you let me take a few for the files? I'd be careful with them." She looked at the 3 curling pieces of paper on the rail. They were nothing to her. She could make more before supper. And a man from the government wanted them for a file in an office 2,000 miles away, and that seemed to her about as likely to matter as the dust that would bury them by Friday anyway. "You can have them," she said, "if you want." He took all 3. He folded them, careful, along the natural curl, and slid them inside his coat against his chest. He gave her a card that she put in her apron and forgot. He thanked her mother, who'd come to the door, and Ingrid said something polite and told Cora to get back to the trough. The car labored away up the road and the dust closed over it. He said Washington was collecting pictures of hard times, Cora told her mother that night. And Ingrid said something about foolishness in government men, and Cora said, "I never thought about it again." Remember that. She never thought about it again. But those 3 pieces of paper were already moving. They were riding east in a stranger's coat, toward a printing press, toward 2.5 million kitchen tables, toward a whole country that was about to start weeping over the hands of a woman it would never meet. Cora went back to the trough. She had no idea. That's the whole engine of this story. She had no idea, and neither did they, and only you know. 2 days later, the first blow landed, and it came from inside the family. Aunt Verna Kessler was Ingrid's older sister. She'd married a man who'd had a quarter section of his own until the spring, when the bank took it, and losing it had not made Verna gentle. It had made her hard as a fence wire. She'd moved in with a cousin down the road, and she came up to the Haugen place most days, to help, she said. Though the help came wrapped in so much scolding that it wasn't clear which was the point. She had ideas about how a girl should spend her time, and Cora's drawing offended every one of them. Verna found the pictures on the porch rail. Cora had laid out 4 of them to set in the evening cool, a new one of the depot, one of the windmill, and 2 of her mother. Verna came around the corner with an armload of kindling for the cook stove, saw the paper, and made a sound in her throat like a hen. "What is this?" she said. It wasn't a question. She picked one up between 2 fingers like it was something dead. "Ingrid, Ingrid, come look what this girl does with her afternoons while you break your back." Ingrid came to the door, drying her hands. She didn't defend it. That was the thing that cut Cora deeper than Verna ever could. Her mother just looked tired and said, "Cora, help your aunt with the fire." And Verna, already moving, already decided, took 2 of the drawings, the depot and one of the hands, and pushed them down into the kindling in her arms. "Papers, dear," she said. "Papers for accounts and for scripture, and not for a dreamer's scribbling. You'll thank me when you're grown." And she carried them to the stove, and she opened the iron door, and she fed them in with the willow twigs. Cora watched the depot burn. She watched the men in the breadline curl and blacken and go up the flue as smoke. She watched her mother's hands catch and vanish. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying was a thing you did on the inside where Verna couldn't collect on it. She turned around and went back out to the pump, and she started another one before the light was gone. That was her answer to everything. She started another one. But something small had changed in her, and you should know it, because it's what makes the ending land. She started, that night, to keep the good ones hidden. The tin under the porch. She'd found it in the spring, an old flour tin with a tight lid, wedged up under the porch floor in the cool dark where a dog might sleep. She began to put the drawings she loved most in there, rolled careful, out of the reach of Verna's kindling arms. The depot she could make again. But her mother at the cold stove, she wasn't going to lose that one to a stove. The second blow came at the depot, a week on, and it came with the milk cow. It had gotten to where the family had to sell things toward the note. Not because $612 could be scraped together out of a milk cow, it couldn't, not near. But because the bank wanted to see the family trying, and because every dollar was a dollar. So Halvard loaded the cow, a gentle brown thing named Pearl that Cora had milked since she was 9. And they drove her into Boise City in the back of the old Ford truck, the one truck the family had left, to sell her at the stockyard for whatever a drought country cow would bring. It wasn't much. Cora stood by the truck while her father haggled, and the men leaned on the rail and spat and named prices that were an insult, and she had her nub of charcoal and the back of a feed receipt. And without deciding to, the way she always did it, she began to draw. She drew the pens and the thin cattle and the men on the rail with their hat brims down. She drew Pearl with her soft eye turned back toward them. It kept her from crying while her father sold the cow. Two men on the rail noticed. Grown men, with nothing kind in them that day, because there wasn't much kind going around. "Look at that," one of them said, loud, for the pens to hear. "The Haugen girl's drawing pictures. Whole county blowing away and the girl draws pictures." The other one laughed. "Draw the poorhouse, honey," he called. "Draw it good. That's where the whole lot of you's headed. Get it while it's standing." The men along the rail laughed the low mean laugh of people glad, for a minute, that the trouble was landing on somebody else. Halvard's neck went red and he didn't turn around, because turning around meant a fight he was too tired and too proud to have, and because a part of him, this is the hard truth of it, a part of him half agreed. He'd have rather his daughter stood by the truck with her hands folded and her eyes down like a girl whose family was going under ought to. The drawing shamed him a little, in front of the men, and he took the low price for Pearl and he told Cora to get in the truck. And they drove the 40 minutes home without a word between them, the dust coming in around the doors. Cora put the drawing of Pearl in the tin under the porch that night. Then she sat in the dark a while, and she did the thing she was best at in all the world. She decided it didn't touch her. She was 17, and she had already built a room inside herself where the words couldn't reach, and she went in there and she shut the door, and in the morning she started another one. But the worst was still coming, and it came at the school, and it is the thing this whole story is named for. Cora still went to the county school when the work allowed it, 3 days out of 5, because Ingrid held on to the idea that a girl needed her letters even when the world was ending. The schoolmaster was a man named Alden Pruitt. He was maybe 50, narrow and precise, with a stiff collar he kept clean in a county where clean was a kind of miracle. And he had opinions about talent the way some men have opinions about the weather, settled and loud, and impossible to argue with. Pruitt had decided, some years back, that he was Mercer Flat's judge of what counted as real, what was refined, what deserved to be looked at, and what did not. And a farm girl who drew with a burnt stick on the back of auction bills did not, in his book, deserve to be looked at. That morning he came in with a magazine under his arm, and he was bright with it, the way a small man gets bright when he thinks he's about to be seen as fine. "Children," he said, "I want you to see something." He unfolded the magazine. It was the National Clarion. 2.5 million copies a week, in kitchens from New York to San Francisco. He'd gotten it somehow, out here, weeks late, and he'd torn a full page from it, and he pinned that page to the board at the front of the room where all 30 of them could see. It was a drawing, a charcoal drawing, printed large, filling the whole page. It showed a farm child sitting on the step of an abandoned house, the door open behind her, a curtain still in the window. A small shoe on the step. Underneath it, in the fine print of the caption, it said, "The Dust Child." And below that, "From a farm child of the dust, artist unknown." The country was weeping over that picture. That's what the caption said in more words. Letters were coming into the Clarion by the sackful. People in cities who'd never seen a dust storm were pinning it up over their sinks. A senator had held it up on the floor of the Congress. It had done more to make the comfortable understand the panhandle than any speech ever had. And nobody, anywhere, knew whose hand had made it. Cora knew. Cora sat in the third row with her heart going very slow and very hard because she had drawn that. She had drawn it on the back of the Dunmore auction bill, sitting in their empty dooryard in the spring, and she had laid it out on the porch rail to set, and a man named Silas Meade had folded it into his coat and driven it east. There it was, pinned to the board, filling the whole page of the biggest magazine in America, the picture the whole country was weeping over. And she couldn't say a word. Who would believe her? A dreamer's scribbling on the board next to the finest thing the county had ever seen. Pruitt stood beside it, glowing. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is what a gift looks like. This is refinement. This is a hand touched by God, children, And it comes from a farm child, yes, but do not be fooled, this is 1 in a million. This is a soul that sees. He let that sit. And then, because a small man cannot resist the drop, because he had an audience and he'd been building to it, he turned. He looked straight down the rows at Cora Belle Haugen in her faded dress with the charcoal stain on her apron pocket. And then, he said, "There is real life." Cora, the whole room turned to look at her. "You draw too, don't you? You scribble. On your feed bills, I've seen it. A ripple of laughter, already starting. Let me tell you something, and I say it for your own good. So you'll turn your hand to honest work before it's too late. You will never make a single thing the world wants to see, not one. That gift on the wall, that is given to a chosen few. And you, child, are not among them." The class laughed. It's an ugly sound. 30 children laughing, when you're the one in the third row. It broke over her and she sat in it. She looked at the picture on the board. Her Dunmore door, her curtain, her small shoe on the step, the picture that was making a nation weep. And she looked at the man standing under it, telling her she would never make a single thing anyone wanted to see. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that there was nothing she could say that would land. So she said nothing. She kept her face still. She kept the lines steady, the way she did everything. And you saw it. You saw that the picture on the board was her hand. You saw the man praise the artist and crush the girl in the same breath, never once dreaming they were the same person. That's the whole engine, turning over right in front of you while the town stays blind. Hold that. Because Cora, walking home that afternoon through the brown light, was about to find the one thing that would tell her the ground under her whole life had already shifted. She wasn't looking for it. She'd gone under the porch after the tin, the way she did most evenings now, to add the day's drawing to the roll where Verna couldn't reach it. Her hand found the tin in the dark, and it found something else beside it, wedged up in the same cool gap. An envelope. Government paper. She'd put it there herself, weeks back, and half forgotten it, the way she forgot most things that came from grown men in suits. She'd never even properly read it. Meade had mailed it. It had come while the note and the drought and the burning kindling filled every waking hour. And she'd tucked it away and let it go. She took it out into the last of the light, and she read it, sitting in the dust with her back against the porch post. It was from the Federal Farm Survey. It thanked her, Miss Haugen, for the pictures field agent Meade had collected. And it told her, in the flat, careful language of a government office, that several of her drawings had been selected for national reproduction. That one in particular had been published in the National Clarion and in 11 other papers, and had drawn a response the survey described as unprecedented. That the pictures were being credited, per the artist's wish as understood by the agent, only as from a farm child of the dust, and that the survey— this was the part that made her hands go cold— the survey wished to reproduce more, and to that end enclosed a release. A form. If she would sign it and return it, her name could be printed under the work, if she chose. It was, the letter said, entirely up to her. Cora sat very still in the brown light with the letter in her 2 hands. Everything Pruitt had said that day, in front of the laughing room, unspooled and reversed. You will never make a single thing the world wants to see. And here in her lap was a government letter that said a country was weeping over a thing she'd made on the back of a dead family's auction bill. The gift he'd praised on the board was hers. The dust child was hers. She was, without a soul in Cimarron County knowing it, the most looked-at artist in America, and she was sitting in the dust behind a porch that the bank was going to sell out from under her in 6 weeks. She should have run into the house waving the letter. Any other girl would have. She could have walked into that schoolroom the next morning and laid it on Pruitt's desk and watched his face come apart. She could have quieted Verna forever. She could have. You want her to. Sitting there, you're already writing the scene where she does it. She didn't. Here is what Cora Belle Haugen believed, down in the room inside herself where the words couldn't reach. She believed that being unseen was her lot. Not a thing that had happened to her, a thing she was. She'd been the laziest girl in the county since she was small. She'd been the scribbler. She'd sat under a picture of her own soul while a whole room laughed. And somewhere in all of that she'd stopped expecting the world to look at her and started, quietly, expecting only to look at the world. That was the whole of what she wanted, to draw the truth of what she saw so it wouldn't be forgotten. Not to be famous. She couldn't even hold the shape of famous in her mind. It slid off. It belonged to other people, to the chosen few, to the hand touched by God on the board, and even now, even holding the proof, some part of her couldn't quite believe the hand was hers. So she didn't run into the house. She sat with the letter until the light was gone. And then she rolled it back up and put it in the tin with her drawings, the private ones, the mother at the stove ones. And she pushed the tin back up under the porch into the dark. And she told no one. Not her mother, who thought her a dreamer, not her father, who was too proud and too tired to see her, and certainly not Aunt Verna. But something had settled in her over those days. Not a plan. Cora never had a plan, that wasn't the shape of her. Call it a decision, made so quietly she barely heard herself make it. If the pictures could go where she couldn't, if a thing she'd made could sit in a stranger's kitchen in a city she'd never see and make them understand, then the pictures should go. All of them. The real ones. The ones in the tin. Not to save herself. She didn't believe she could be saved. And she wasn't asking to be. But her mother's hands, her mother at the cold stove, if those could be seen, truly seen, by someone somewhere, then the years those hands had worked would not blow away with everything else. That was worth the giving. The next morning, before the light, before her chores, she did the one thing that sealed the whole story and could never be taken back. She took the tin out from under the porch. She took out the release form, and she smoothed it on the porch step, and she signed it, in her plain, careful hand, Cora Bell Haugen. Mercer Flat, Oklahoma. She wrote her name where they asked for it, and looked at it a moment. Her own name on a government paper, strange as a stranger's. And then she took the drawings. Not a few. All of them. The largest ones. The ones she'd never shown a living soul. The whole depot in a single sweep. The Dunmore place in winter. The road that ran to nothing. And the one she'd have run into a fire to save. Her mother standing at the cold black stove with her cracked hands open over the iron where there was nothing to cook. She rolled them together, careful, the good ones and the private ones. Her whole hidden heart in a roll of butcher paper and dead men's auction bills. She wrapped them in a clean flour sack. She addressed them to the Federal Farm Survey off the card Meade had given her. And she carried the whole bundle 2 miles down the section road to the crossroads where the mail truck came before anyone in the house was awake. And she put it in the box and she raised the little flag. She told no one. She expected nothing back, nothing but that the pictures be seen, truly, by whoever it was that looked. She walked home in the early brown light with her hands empty and her chores still ahead of her. A quiet farm girl the whole county called the laziest thing in it, and behind her, in a tin mailbox at a crossroads in the Panhandle, sat the entire secret heart of the dust child, on its way east. She didn't know what she'd started. She thought she'd sent some pictures to a file. What she'd actually done was set the reveal on a course straight back to Mercer Flat, to the church hall, to the auction, to every face that had ever laughed at her. Because you don't credit a nation's most looked-at artist by name and keep it quiet. Somewhere back east, a man named Silas Meade was about to open a flour sack and unroll a drawing of a woman at a cold stove and go very still. And out at the crossroads, the little flag was up and the mail truck was coming, and there was no calling it back now. The days after went slow. That was the strange part. She'd set the whole thing loose, and the world just kept on the way it always had. Cora milked in the dark. She carried water. She scraped the last of the meal from the bottom of the barrel and stretched it with what the garden gave, which was almost nothing that summer. The wind came up in the afternoons the way it always did and laid its brown hand over everything, and in her apron pocket the burnt willow nub rode against her hip, worn down now to a stub she could barely hold. She kept drawing. She couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to. It was the one thing in her life that felt like breathing. But she watched the road now. She hadn't before. Before, the road was just the road. The thing that carried the mail truck and the dust and the men going west with everything they owned tied to a fender. Now she looked at it. She'd catch herself at the well, the bucket dead in her hands, staring at the long, empty stretch of it where it ran to nothing. Waiting, not knowing what for. The foreclosure clock did not care that she was waiting. 60 days. That number sat over the house like a second sun. She heard her father say it once, low, to her mother, when they thought she was asleep. $612. He said the figure the way another man might say a curse. Ingrid didn't answer him. There was no answer. The cow was gone to the Boise City stockyard already. Pearl, Cora had drawn her the night before they sold her, the wide, patient face of her, so there'd be something left when the money was spent. There always was, for Cora. Something left. A picture where the thing had been. Halvard would not take relief. That was the wall the whole family broke against. There was a federal line, a way for a veteran to hold his ground a while longer. And he would not walk into the office and sign for it. He'd built the house with his own ruined hands after the Great War, laid every board, and he would not be a man who took the government's charity to keep it. Ingrid begged him once, quiet, at the stove. He just looked at her. His hands were the color of old harness leather, and they didn't close all the way anymore. He said, "I'll not go begging in my own county." And that was the end of it. Cora drew those hands, too. She drew everything. She drew the auction bills that came now for the neighbors, one after another, the Dunmores and the Rasmussens and the Pyle place 2 miles off. She drew them on the backs of the very bills that announced them. Somebody ought to remember these people, she thought. Somebody ought to keep their faces. She never once thought her own family's bill would be the next one nailed to the church door. But it was coming. She could feel it coming the way you feel weather. Then the schoolyard. It was a hot, still morning near the end of the term, and a tear sheet came skating across the packed dirt on a gust, a page torn loose from a magazine, gone brown at the edges. It fetched up against the fence rail and hung there shuddering. A boy named Emmett Pyle chased it down and smoothed it out, and a knot of children gathered, and Cora came around the side of the schoolhouse with a pail and saw what it was before she was close enough to read a word of it. It was the picture. Her picture. The dust child, printed enormous, the whole nation looking at it, and here it was blown up against a fence rail in Cimarron County like any trash off the road. Emmett squinted at it. He turned it sideways. And he said, "Slow, you know, that looks like the old Dunmore place. Look at the porch post there. That's the Dunmore porch post, I'd swear it." Cora's heart went off like a jackrabbit. She stood dead still with the pail dragging her arm down. Everything in her wanted to run, and everything in her wanted to say it, to open her mouth and say, "That's mine, I drew that, that's my hand," and she did neither. She just stood. Another boy laughed. "Everything looks like the Dunmore place," he said. "Everything out here looks like everything. It's all dead." And that was true enough that the others laughed too, and Emmett let the page go, and the wind took it on across the yard and over the fence and away toward the section road, spinning, and nobody watched it go but Cora. The moment passed. It always passed. She stood there and let her heart come back down out of her throat, and she thought, "They will never see it. They can be looking straight at it, and they will never once see me in it." And she didn't know yet whether that was the thing that would save her or the thing that would break her heart clean in two. Word came from the east that the leaves were turning back there, though nothing turned in the panhandle, there being nothing left to turn. Word came another way, too. A letter from the Federal Farm Survey, addressed to her, that she took from the crossroads box herself and read walking home, and then hid under the porch in the flour tin with the tight lid, in the cool dark where the letters lived now. They were sending an exhibition west, it said. A traveling exhibition. The Clarion's own editor meant to come with it, to the very country the pictures came from. They wanted her there. They spelled her name out full in the letter, Cora Bell Haugen, and seeing her own name printed by a machine in a government office 2,000 miles away did something to her she couldn't have told you. She sat under the porch a long while with the letter in her lap. Then she put it back in the tin and set the lid and went and fed the chickens. She should have burned it. She knew that later. She should have burned every scrap. Because the porch was not hers alone. It was Aunt Verna who found it. Verna Kessler had lost her own quarter section the year before and moved in on her sister's Mercy, and Mercy sat poorly on her. She was a hard, dry woman who counted every biscuit and read scripture like a bill of complaint against the world. She was after a mouse under the porch, she said afterward, poking with a broom handle. And the broom handle found the tin, and the tin gave up the letter, and Verna Kessler could read. She read it standing right there in the yard. Cora saw her do it. Cora came around the corner of the house with an armload of stove wood and saw her aunt with the government letter open in both hands and the flour tin at her feet in the dirt, and there was one long terrible second when the whole thing hung in the air between them. Then Verna's face closed like a door. She didn't say a word to Cora. She folded the letter along its own creases, careful, the way you'd handle evidence, and she put it inside the front of her dress, and she walked past Cora and past the house and out the gate onto the road. Cora dropped the wood and it clattered every which way across the yard, and she did not even feel it hit her feet. It was Sunday. That was the worst of it. It was Sunday and the whole flat was gathered at the church, the last Sunday before the auction, and Verna Kessler walked the 2 miles into the meeting with that letter against her heart, and she waited for the doxology to end and the people to come blinking out into the white light on the church steps, and then she held it up. Cora was there. Her mother had made her come. She stood at the bottom of the steps in the crowd with her father's hand heavy on her shoulder, and she watched her aunt lift the letter over the heads of the congregation like a preacher lifting the book. "Now hear this," Verna Kessler said. Her voice carried. It had always carried. She'd have made a fine auctioneer herself. "Now here is a thing. My sister's girl, the one you've all watched idle her hands away her whole life while good people worked, my sister's girl has got the notion the government of the United States wants her scribbling. Here it is in black and white. A letter. Come all the way from Washington to tell Cora Haugen her doodles are wanted for a picture show." A laugh went through the crowd. It started low, and it built. Cora felt it come up around her like water rising. And Alden Pruitt stepped out of it. The schoolmaster was a narrow, precise man, and he took the letter from Verna's hand as though he were the only one present fit to judge a document. He held it at arm's length. He read it down. And then he smiled a small, dry smile, and he handed it back, and he said, loud enough for all of them, "It's a swindle. Plain as day. They send these to the desperate. They've read the auction notices in the county paper, and they prey on foolish girls with a fancy in their heads." He looked right at Cora then. "There is no artist in Mercer Flat," he said. "I would know. I taught every child in this county their letters, and I promise you, the world is not waiting on Cora Haugen." The class laughs Cora had known all her life. But this was the whole town. She did not defend herself. She wanted you to know that. Every word of it was a lie about her, and every word of it she could have unmade with a single sentence. "That letter is real. That picture on your schoolroom wall is mine. The whole country you're standing in weeps at my hand and doesn't know it." She had it right there behind her teeth. And she looked at her father's face, gray and set and ashamed, the day before he lost his land, and she looked at her mother's hands twisting her Sunday gloves, and she thought, not like this. Not to win an argument on the church steps. And she kept her mouth shut and she let them laugh. And she took the deepest wound of her whole life standing perfectly still, the way she'd learned to take all the others. They walked home in the dust, the three of them, and nobody spoke, and behind them the auction was set for the very next day. The bank's man came at 9 in the morning. They held it in the church hall, because that was the only room in Mercer Flat big enough. And because there was a cruelty in it that nobody named, that a family should be sold up in the same room they'd worshipped in all their lives. The banksman was young and soft-handed and not unkind, which was somehow worse. He set his papers on a table at the front, and he set a little wooden gavel beside them, and the folding chairs filled up. Because in a dying county a foreclosure is the only theater there is. They came to watch the Haugans go under. The same faces, Verna in the second row with her chin up, Pruitt near the front with his hat on his knee, the Piles, the Rasmussens, everyone who'd laughed, all of them gathered in the good light of the tall hall windows to see it done. Cora sat with her family in the front row. Her father sat like a man in church, straight-backed, staring at nothing. He'd worn his good coat. Her mother's hands were folded so tight the knuckles had gone white. Cora had the willow nub in her pocket and nothing to draw on, and nowhere to look, and she looked at her mother's hands, and she thought, I will keep those, whatever else they take. I have already kept those. The banksman cleared his throat. He read the note aloud in a flat courthouse voice. The Haugan Quarter Section, 160 acres, Mercer Flat, Cimarron County. Sum owed to the Cimarron Farmers and Merchants Trust, $612. He said the sale would proceed. He raised the little gavel. And that was when they heard the cars. Two of them. You could hear an engine a long way off out there in the flat quiet, and this was two. And behind them the heavier grind of a truck. The whole hall turned its head toward the windows, the way a field of wheat turns in wind. The cars came up the church road trailing plumes of dust that hung in the still air, and they stopped, and doors opened, and boots came up the church steps. And the double doors at the back of the hall swung wide and let the white light in. Silas Meade filled the doorway. He was older than the man who'd asked for water at the fence, or he carried himself older, a survey field director now, the letter had said, and he wore it. The leather notebook was in his coat still. She could see the shape of it. Behind him came a stout man in city clothes with spectacles and ink on his cuff, and behind them both came two workmen carrying a wooden crate between them by rope handles, and then another crate, and another. The banksman stood with his gavel in the air. I'm afraid, he said. This is a private sale. I know exactly what it is. Meade said. His voice was quiet and it went to every corner of that hall. I've come a long way to be at it. I'll ask you to hold your hammer 5 minutes, and then you can do as the law requires. He didn't wait for the young man to answer. He was already walking up the center aisle, and the editor was behind him, and the workmen were setting the crates down along the wall, under the tall windows. In the best light in the building. Cora could not breathe. She knew what was in the crates. She'd known from the sound of the cars. And there was nowhere to go, and no way to stop it, and no calling it back, just like the mail truck, just like the flag, and she gripped the willow nub in her pocket so hard it snapped in two, and she never even felt it. Meade stood at the front of the hall where the auctioneer's table was, and he turned and faced them all. Neighbors, he said. My name is Silas Meade. I'm with the Federal Farm Survey, and some of you have seen my car at your fences these 2 years. And let me take your picture or take a drawing off your porch rail. I've carried what I gathered back east, to Washington, where the country's been trying to understand what's happened to you out here. To put a face on it. He paused. Well, we found the face, not in a photograph. In these. He nodded to the workmen, and they pried the lid off the first crate. They lifted the print out, and it was the size of a door. They stood it against the wall in the light, and the whole hall drew one breath together. It was the breadline at the depot. Cora's breadline, the men in the queue with their hats pulled down and their collars up, and the boy at the end holding his father's coat, every face she'd drawn from the shadow of the water tank 2 winters back, only enormous now, printed clean and dark, so you could see the very grain of the charcoal, the very tremor of the line where her cold hand had shaken. Somebody in the crowd said, "Lo, that's," and stopped. Because they knew it. Cora watched it move across their faces like a shadow crossing a field. They knew this picture. Not from the depot. From the magazines. From the Clarion pages that had blown across their own yards. From the talk that had come up the road all summer about the drawing the whole nation was weeping over. The anonymous one. The dust child. Here it was, standing against the church hall wall in Mercer Flat, in the flesh, 4 feet tall. They pried open the second crate. The Dunmore place. The abandoned house in winter, the porch post Emmett Pyle had known, the road running past it to nothing. Up it went beside the first, and now the murmur in the hall was a real thing, a rising water, and the editor stepped forward, the stout man with the ink on his cuff, and he raised his voice over it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I am the editor of the National Clarion. Our circulation is 2.5 million copies. That means these pictures, have hung this year in something near 3 million American homes." He let that sit. "There have been letters. I have never in my life seen letters like it. 30 children in a single schoolroom in Ohio wrote to us together. A woman in Maine sent $1 and asked only that it go to the child who drew these. 11 other papers have reprinted them from us. People have wept, sir," he turned to the bank's man. "Almost gently, grown men have wept over these, in cities that have never seen a dust storm, because for the first time they understood. And Meade said, 'We never knew the name.' That was the thing. For a year the whole country has been weeping over pictures signed by nobody. A farm child of the dust, that's all we could print. Until this spring, when a flour sack came to my office with the rest inside it, and a release, signed, he reached into his coat and took out a single printed card. And he held it up, and he read from it, and his voice was not loud, but it did not need to be, because there was not one sound in that hall. 'Cora Belle Haugen,' he read. Mercer Flat, Oklahoma. The name went through the room like a current through water. For one whole second, nobody moved. And then, all at once, the whole hall turned. Every face, every one of them, turned from the pictures on the wall to the front row where the Haugens sat, to the quiet girl between her mother and father, the laziest girl in Cimarron County, sitting with her hands empty in her lap and 2 halves of a burnt willow nub in her pocket and her eyes shining. Pruitt made a sound. Cora heard it, because he was close. The schoolmaster had a bit of chalk in his hand. He was never without it. He carried it the way other men carry a watch. And he'd been turning it over and over through the whole proceeding. And now his fingers just opened. The chalk dropped. It hit the plank floor and broke. And in that silence it was loud as a shot, and every head near him turned, and Alden Pruitt sat there staring at the breadline on the wall, with his mouth working and no words coming out of it. "There is no artist in Mercer Flat," he'd said. "I would know." He was looking straight at the proof that he had never once in his life looked at anything. His face had gone the color of the paper the drawings were printed on. And Verna Kessler in the second row, who'd read a real letter aloud on the church steps and called it a swindle, who'd held the truth up over her head for the whole town to laugh at. Cora turned just enough to see her aunt. Verna's mouth had come open. It opened, and it closed, and it opened again, like a fish drowning in air, and no sound came, and then all the starch went out of the woman at once, and she sat down hard against the back of her chair, as though something had cut the string that held her up. Her hands came up over the front of her dress, over the very place she'd carried that letter to church. She could not look at the pictures. She looked at her own lap, and she stayed that way. Nobody laughed. That was the thing Cora would remember longest. Of the whole day the hall was full of every face that had ever laughed at her, and not one of them laughed now, and the silence where the laughter should have been was the sweetest and the most terrible sound she'd ever heard. But it wasn't done. There was a third crate. Meade nodded to the workmen, and they set their hands to the last lid, and Cora knew, she'd known from the size of it, the moment they carried it in, and she reached out without thinking and took her mother's hand, took those 2 cracked and work-hardened hands in both of hers and held on. The lid came off. They lifted the print. And they stood it in the light. It was Ingrid. It was Cora's mother at the cold black stove, her cracked hands open over the cold iron where there was nothing in the world to cook. The picture Cora had said she'd run into a fire to save, the one she'd never shown a living soul, printed the size of a barn door, hung now in the church hall in front of the whole flat, every line of that beloved tired face laid open for $2.5 million. Strangers to have already wept over, and for one woman in the front row to see for the first time. Ingrid Haugen made a sound Cora had never heard her make. She rose halfway out of the folding chair. She stared at herself on the wall, at her own hands, her own stove, her own bowed shoulders made monumental, made worthy, made into the very face of a nation's grief. And she understood in one instant that the whole country had already wept over her and never known her name, had grieved for her across 3 million kitchen tables while she stood at that cold stove alone, thinking herself the least and last woman in the world. And she put her hands over her face. The very hands. And she wept. Cora was up and across to her before the tears fell. She put her arms around her mother, and the crowd, Cora felt it more than saw it. The crowd parted, drew back, gave them the room, all those hard, silent faces stepping away to leave a mother and a daughter alone in the light in front of the whole world. And Halvard Haugen stood up. The old veteran, who would not take the government's charity. Who'd sat that whole morning like a man carved out of the same wood as his ruined house. He stood, and he looked a long moment at his wife on the wall, at his daughter's arms around his living wife, and then he reached up and took off his hat. He held it against his chest the way a man does at a graveside or before a flag. He did not say anything. Halvard was not a man who said things. But he took off his hat in front of his neighbors, and that was everything, and Cora saw it over her mother's shoulder, and it broke her open at last, and she wept too, finally, into her mother's hair, the two of them weeping together in front of the picture. And it was not grief. That was the strange gift of it. After all of it, it was not grief. The editor let it be a good while. Then, quietly, he came and stood near them, and he spoke. To Cora now, only to Cora, though the whole hall heard. "Miss Haugen," he said, "there's a thing to settle and I'll be plain about it, because I think plainness is owed you. The survey is establishing a record of the plains, a true record, in the hand of someone who sees it truly. Mr. Meade has recommended you for it. It's honest work at an honest wage, the same the survey pays any field man to keep on drawing this country the way you've been drawing it." He glanced, just once, at the table where the bank's man still stood with his forgotten gavel. "It's a wage," he said, "not a gift. You earned it before any of us knew your name. What you choose to do with the first of it is your own affair. But I'd not see a family sold up over $600 the same morning the nation learns whose hand it's been weeping into." He said it kindly, and he said it so the whole room would hear that it was a wage and not charity, so that not even Halvard Haugen could refuse it, and Cora understood that too. That Meade had thought even of her father's pride. Had carried it 2,000 miles along with the crates. She found her voice. It was the first time most of that town had heard it in years. "Thank you," she said. To Meade, and to the editor, and to none of them and all of them. It wasn't much. It was 3 words, the way she'd always spoken, the quiet farm girl who could say a whole world in a line of charcoal and hardly a sentence out loud. But it filled the hall. "Thank you," she said, and she did not turn and crow at Pruitt, and she did not throw one word back at Verna, though she had a year of words owed and every soul there would have let her spend them. She just thanked the men who'd looked, and she stepped back down beside her mother, and she took her mother's hand again. That was her whole revenge. To be seen and to stay kind. It was enough. It was more than enough. It emptied the room of everything that had ever been said against her. The banksman set his gavel down on the table, very softly, as if any noise at all would be a sin now, and he began quietly to put his papers away. They went out through a hall that would not meet their eyes, and at the door, Pruitt was standing. He'd got up somewhere in it all and made his way to the door, whether to flee or to speak Cora never knew, and he was there when the Haugans came out. And he had to say something. A man like that, he could not let a silence be. He looked at Cora and his mouth twitched, and what came out of him, in a voice gone thin as paper, was this: "I taught her penmanship." That was all. I taught her penmanship. As if to lay some little claim, some thread of credit, on the hand that had moved a nation while he stood in front of it calling it nothing. Cora looked at him. She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't have been a kindness or a cruelty, and she didn't have either one to spare on him just then. She walked past him into the light, and he was left saying it to the doorframe, "I taught her penmanship," smaller each time. And Verna Kessler had not risen at all. She sat on in the emptying hall, in the second row. In front of the picture of her sister she could not look at, and as the family passed she spoke, not to them, not to anyone, to the air in front of her. "I only ever said paper was dear," she said. That was all. As though the whole of it, the burning of the drawings for kindling, the letter held up on the church steps, the word swindle. All of it could be folded down small and made into a thing about the price of paper. I only ever said paper was dear. Nobody answered her either. She was left with it. Sometimes that is the whole of a person's punishment, to be left alone in a bright room with the thing they said. The rain came in the fall. It came the way everyone had stopped believing it would. A low gray morning with a smell in the wind that made the old men go out and stand in their yards with their faces turned up. And then it fell. Soft and steady and all day long, and the packed dead ground drank it and drank it. Cora stood on the porch and watched it come down, and did not draw it. Some things you just stand in. The note was met. The first of the survey wage went to the Cimarron Farmers and Merchants Trust, $612 counted out honest against honest work. And the young man at the bank gave Halvard a receipt, and Halvard folded it into his coat and said thank you, and walked out a man who still owned the ground his own hands had raised a house on. He never spoke of the auction after. But he mended the fence that fall, the whole line of it, and he let Cora come and draw him doing it, and that was his way of speaking of it. Her picture hangs in the county school now. The mother at the stove, a print of it, sent West special by the editor, and it hangs on the wall where the children can see it. And under it, on a small card, is her name. Cora Bell Haugan. And it was Pruitt who pinned it there. That was the one thing he could do, and to his credit, small and late, he did it. He put her name up on his own wall with his own hands, under the picture he'd once torn from a magazine to shame her with. And he made the children learn who she was. Maybe that squared something for him. Maybe not. But the name is up, and it stays up, and every child in Cimarron County knows it now. Cora keeps drawing. She works for the survey still, some seasons, drawing the plains as they mend, the first crops coming back green out of the ground that everyone gave up on. She's cut a fresh willow nub. She still likes the burnt willow, for all she could buy proper charcoal now. It makes a line that the store-bought kind never will. And on the first green morning after that first rain, she carried it out to the mended fence with a scrap of butcher paper, and her mother came and stood beside her, close, the way they stood now. And Cora crouched in the dirt where she'd always crouched, and drew the first green blade pushing up out of the dead ground. Thin and bright and stubborn as anything alive. Her mother watched her do it. Her mother, who for 17 years had thought her girl was idle, watched the hand move and the line come true, and she didn't say a word. Because there wasn't a word needed anymore. She just put her cracked hand on her daughter's shoulder and left it there. Some gifts are seen by the whole world before the people at the next table ever look up. That's the truth of it. Cora Bell Haugan moved a nation to tears from the floor of a dying county, and the ones who ate at her own table, who passed her in her own schoolyard, who shared her own name and her own porch, never once looked close enough to see it. Until the day the world made them look. until the day her name was read out loud in a church hall, and every face that had laughed turned, and found the artist had been sitting quiet among them the whole time, keeping the line steady, waiting to be seen. She's still out there, drawing the green come back to the plains. Tell me the town you're watching from.